Good morning. Welcome to this Black History Month presentation. I'm Dr. Charity Clay. I teach sociology here, and I'm doing kind of a workshop presentation about how to love Black women. Now, this is not in terms of like necessarily romantic or, since Valentine's Day is coming up, but it's more how to understand how to support and care for Black women in general. So it's for everybody. If you have a Black woman in your life, this will apply to you. So don't feel like, well, I'm not in a relationship with a Black woman, so I don't know why I'm here. It applies to any women that you care for in your life. If you're a teacher, it could apply to your students. If you have friends, family members, anyone in your support system, it's just a general understanding in terms of what it means to love, how we understand love, and how we show that love to Black women, specifically considering the way that society has constructed an understanding of who Black women are. The first thing I want to make sure is that bring your openness. If some of this stuff is redundant to you, then hopefully you can use it to talk to people who may not understand what we're talking about. But feel free to take notes and ask questions. If something is confusing to you, ask. I don't have a problem with slowing things down to make sure that everyone understands what we're doing here. The other thing is, take time. I'm going to ask you all some questions and ask you all to reflect on them, or ask you to turn to someone near you and talk about what this question makes you think of, or what some of the things I show make you think of. Be present in this moment. So the first thing I want to ask, and just shout out things that come to mind, I always ask, what do you love about Black women? So we'll start there, if anyone wants to start. Now the thing is, you should have something. If you don't, that's okay. By the end of this, you'll have plenty of things to say about why you love Black women. So start off. Confidence. Strength. Culture. Beauty. Resilience. Lovable. Anything else? Curvy. Misunderstood. These are the things that we love about Black women. I say that because one of the things that I want to stress is that sometimes we feel love, but we don't express it. So if we hold all the love that we have for people inside and we don't express it to them, then they don't know. Right? So never feel afraid or ashamed to affirm the love that you have for people, because you may be the only one that reminded them of that day. Right? I know it feels so sometimes uncomfortable, but understand that, especially when we're talking about Black women who are facing so many different types of systemic oppression and individualized oppression, those affirmations become very important on a daily basis. Right? I'm gonna show a couple of quotes, because one thing that this is about kind of the process of learning and unlearning. And one of the things I want to help you all understand is that I believe that people act on the best intentions, but sometimes they're misguided, right? So I believe that generally people are acting out of love, but maybe a misunderstanding of what love looks like to the people that they're interacting with. So I want to show a couple of quotes that kind of comprise the general things that people say they love about Black women. So anyone know who Nikki Giovanni is? Writer. In the spirit of Black History Month, look her up, right? Read some of her poetry. She's a Black woman poet, and she writes amazing things, not just about Black women, but about the Black experience. So she has a quote here from her, she has a poem called Ego Trippin', and it's really kind of tracing the lineage of Black women all the way back to Egypt and talking about, the great things about us. So a part of it, she says, I am so perfect, so divine, so ethereal, so surreal. I cannot be comprehended except by my own permission. I mean, I can fly like a bird in the sky, right? That's just an excerpt from the poem. The whole thing is really amazing. If you have time, before you lose it out of your mind, write that down and go read the poem. But one of the reasons I use that is because we have this construction of Black women as these superhuman, divine beings, right? This idea that we have this superhuman strength, this superhuman ability to do things, which is fine. But what we have to acknowledge is that sometimes that small construction of what black women are limits our ability to see black women in the regular everyday, right? The idea that I can fly, but what if I don't feel like flying today because I'm tired, right? Or what if the idea that being so surreal doesn't affect me today, right? What I want to make sure we understand is that as much as we box in what we love about black women, sometimes it prevents us from seeing the other lovable things about them, right? So it's nothing wrong with saying that you're perfect or divine, but the issue is sometimes if you don't fit into another person's idea of divinity, then they don't give you that love, right? When you close your eyes and you see this black queen or this black woman who is God, any woman who doesn't fit your ideal sometimes isn't worthy of getting that love. Right? So I want to make sure that there's nothing wrong with highlighting and revering black women, but we also want to celebrate the ordinary, right? It doesn't always have to be, I'm loved when I'm at my best. One of the things is being able to love people when they're struggling with being their best or who they are. So although I definitely applaud this idea of holding black women in this high esteem, we don't want to let it taint us from the idea that sometimes I'm tired, right? Sometimes I'm frustrated or mad. Right? Because sometimes this idea of divinity makes it seem like we can't quite be human because we're expected to be superhuman. Right? Next quote. This is a Tupac quote, and it says, "The day I met you, I saw strength, and knew from that point on that you were a pure woman to me, possessing a spirit that was strong. I want smiles to replace your sorrow that you encountered in the past. And since it was strength that attracted me to you, it will take strength to make it last. My negative side will attempt to change you, but please fight that with your all. It will be your strength that keeps us standing while others around us fall." Right? That's a Tupac quote from a poem. And Tupac, in terms of how he dealt with women, is quite a polarizing figure, right? In terms of, in some ways, being objectifying, and in some ways being very revering. I'll talk about that a little bit later in detail. But there's also this construction of black women being strong. And this idea that that's our strength and our resilience and our ability to change the people around us that make us lovable. Again, this is a beautiful thing, but we want to make sure that we're not insisting that black women give their all to someone else in order for them to be recognized, right? Because what's missing from this poem is what he's offering to the woman, right? There's always a narrative about how black women are so supportive, but oftentimes that support isn't reciprocated. And not necessarily because people don't want to, but they don't think that they have to in terms of the way the relationship dynamics operate. Right? So there's nothing wrong with saying black women are strong and resilient and we bring the best out of people. But there's also an issue of not seeing what we give put back into our relationships with people. Right? And I say that because, again, we have these very specific constructions of black women that unfortunately permit us from seeing black women as a whole. Right, because you see them as, an ideal queen or a goddess or a bitch or a hoe, right? Not recognizing that within woman there are qualities that float across these narrow defined categories. So the next question I want to ask for you all to reflect on is, if we talk about all these things that we love about black women, how are black women experiencing that love that we claim to have for them? Is it reflected? Is the love we claim to feel for black women reflected in the way we actually treat them? Right? If you can, turn to someone next to you and talk about that for a couple minutes. Again, the question is the love that we claim to feel manifested in the way that we actually treat them? So if you say you respect or love a black woman's strength, how do you show that love? Or how do you allow them to know that that's something you love? Right? Talk to the people around you. By a show of hands, how many people think overwhelmingly, yes, the love that we claim to have for black women is reflected in the way that society treats them? A question? Is this individually or culturally? This is socially. So you could say culturally, right? Not individually, because I know many of us in here, we do as much as we can to show the people in our lives that we care about them. But outside of this womb of care, outside of the people that we know love us, right? Because we see society propping up images of black women, right? But are black women experiencing the love that we claim to have for them? Who says no? Tell me why. When you say no, why do you say no? Anyone agree? Anyone agree with that sentiment? Anyone with something else? I'll take a couple more hands. Yes. Anyone agree? Agree? One more comment. Yes.
I think that a lot of what we said we love are the things that society shows us not to love. If black women are seen as strong, it's like, well, they're too strong and they're emasculating to black men. If black women are needy, it's like they're too, all these things that we talked about loving are kind of shown opposite in society or opposite in the media, where it's reflected as not being that good, If we're either like dominating to men and emasculating, or we're like, we don't need men, or we don't even want to be, if we're single, or we're walked over if we, love because we're loving too hard, or we're gold diggers, or, it's all these things are like, if we're shown as weak, we're like, we're not even seen as black women, like, oh, because now you're just weak, so you can't be strong and you can't be weak, like, almost like there's no one place for us to be where we can be loved at all.
Make sense? Yeah. Yeah, I think the sentiment is that we recognize that society doesn't reflect the love that it claims to have for us. I'm just going to go through some statistics to show because there's always the statistics about how black women are the #1 entrepreneurs, right? And the idea that we're this successful. And this image of public success often neglects the underlying realities that a lot of us are dealing with, a lot of trauma, a lot of issues that we're struggling with, a lot of self-loathing, a lot of wondering who we are. So I'm going to paint some statistics that kind of show some of the things that black women, not exclusively, but specifically do deal with. So the first one, it says, 67% of black girls indicated that they felt sad or hopeless for 2 weeks or more straight. So this is our girls, right, feeling hopeless. Now, feeling hopeless doesn't mean you're not going to get up every morning and go to school and go to work and do your chores and give to the people you love. But it's a feeling that you have that nothing matters, that nothing is going to get better. And I say this because the things that I'm going to talk about are some things that are invisible a lot of times, and are the things that ultimately make it important that we make sure we show the black women in our lives, the black girls in our lives, that we love them. Because a lot of times this mask that we put on, this strong mask, this resilient mask we put on, often hides some of the things that we're going through. It says black girls are only 16% of girls in school, but 45% of girls with at least one suspension, 42% of girls expelled, 34% of girls arrested on campus, and 31% of girls referred to law enforcement. Now, I paint this because we're all students, right? And we've all been students and interacted with students. A lot of our initiatives in school focus on making sure that we help black boys, because the glaring disparities of black boys, high dropout rates, et cetera. But what we have to acknowledge is that our girls are dealing with a lot of issues too, right? The fact that, this is overrepresentation. If you're only 16% of the population, ideally you should represent 16% of all the things that happen in the population, right? So if almost half of the girls getting suspended in school are black girls, but only 16% of the school is made of black girls, then we have to acknowledge that our girls are being targeted. One of the ways that a lot of black girls experience discipline issues in school is about attitude and about dress and about the way they look and present themselves, the way they talk, the way they behave, right? Not even necessarily violent type of things, but just those things that assert their identity in a way that's uncomfortable because of what society says they should be. And again, I mention these because when you see a black girl or a black woman, you may not know that she's dealing with these things. So it becomes more important to make sure we show love, right? Appreciation, respect, support, because otherwise we end up dealing with all these things alone. This one is always difficult to read, and a truth that sometimes in our communities we don't really address. It says black women are 3 times more likely to die at the hands of a partner or ex-partner than members of any other racial group. Right? A lot of times when we talk about issues of street harassment, it becomes a joke, right? But unfortunately, the issues of women being afraid and assaulted by the people they're in romantic relationships with is a very big issue in our community. So the people that we seek love from, the people that are closest to us, are often the ones that end up abusing and hurting us the most. So the question is, if you can't find love in your partner, where do you find it? Right? And this is why what I'm talking about is not necessarily about romantic relationship type love, but it's about this idea of communal love that everybody can give. You don't have to be in a relationship with a black woman or a black girl to show her that you appreciate her, to give her that support. I definitely want to separate the context of love from romantic love to humanity, understanding that people have value and affirming that value in any opportunity and time that you can. Right? There's one more, and this is leading to that. I talk to a lot of young men, and it's hard to discuss these statistics because if the majority of black women are in relationships with black men, but as you see here, intimate partner homicide is among the leading causes of death for black women ages 15 to 35, then we have to acknowledge that, unfortunately, a lot of these people perpetuating these homicides are black men, right? And it's not an indictment to put black men against black women, but we need to address the way that our relationships become toxic when we're living in a society that doesn't want us to love ourselves or each other, right? Because it often becomes an indictment. And it's not an indictment, it's just the reality that the way we've learned to love each other becomes toxic and often manifests itself in, unfortunately, abuse and death for black women. The leading cause, right? So the primary reason that black women are killed. Now, this isn't about, people die for reasons of health reasons, car accidents, all kind of things. It's specifically talking about in terms of homicide. I saw a couple of questions.
I was asking that, is that talking about like the partner killing the female, or she's just around, he's in some stuff and she's just around and she get killed too?
No. It's the person who's killing, it's the person they're in a relationship with is the person that kills them. Not killed because they're around, but the person who's actually killing them is their partner. There was just last couple weeks, couple months, there was something that was floating around social media with a guy who had got a picture of his wife tattooed on his back. And people were joking like, oh man, like if she ever leaves, he got to kill her because that's serious. And unfortunately, a couple months later, they got into an argument, and that's what happened, right? And I say that because we normalize these things and don't realize that a lot of times people are in abusive relationships trying to find love, right? And if they don't have other outlets to get love, they're going to cling to relationships that are destructive and damaging. If the only place you see love or even a tainted or toxic picture of love or affection is in a specific relationship, right, then that's what you're going to cling to, even if it's positive or negative. But if people if communities wrap people in love, then they won't feel the necessity to stay in situations that are toxic because they can get love from other places. So again, it's not necessarily about romantic love. It's about making sure that the black women, the black girls in your life feel loved. If it's a student you have, if it's somebody that you see at the grocery store because you go all the time, that kind of love is easy to give, but it makes a world of difference because, again, a lot of times black women are dealing with these invisible issues, but because there's this construction of us or this expectation to be strong, we never speak, right? We never divulge what we're struggling with. We just put on a happy face or a resting bitch face, whatever it is, right? And just keep pushing through the day, right? You had a question. I agree. I'm going to actually talk about kind of where this comes from in a little bit, right? Because I want to talk about this process of learning and unlearning. First, we have to learn how we've been trained to understand black women. So this is a Malcolm X quote that I use oftentimes to provide context. One of the reasons I use it is because Malcolm X is often seen as one of the most masculine, stand up for black women, respectable black men, spoke his mind, leaders that we have. Right? And he said the most disrespected woman in America is the black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the black woman. The most neglected person in America is the black woman. So there is an acknowledgement, right, traditionally, historically, that black men recognize that black women are going through these issues. So it's not like there's a lack of acknowledgement that this exists. Now, the odd thing is that this is not one of Malcolm X's most famous quotes. And we have to acknowledge that when we live under the systems of oppression that we do, divide and conquer is always a tool that works. Right? So it's not very widely seen that people like Malcolm X champion the cause of black women, or people like Thomas Sankara champion the cause for black women, because there's this attempt to pit us against each other as men and women. Like you said, we're kind of fighting against and for the same things. So one thing I want to go into now is, how do we make sense of this disconnect? Do we acknowledge that there is a disconnect? Right? A disconnect meaning there's a lack of the way that black women feel love, right, in the way we claim to love them, or the way we may attempt to show love in the way it's actually received. Do we acknowledge that there are some issues with that? Yes? Verbally confirming yes. There we go. Right? There's nothing wrong with being affirmative in your responses, right? So what I want to get to now is kind of, where did this come from? We live in a Eurocentric, capitalist, white-dominated society. So we have to acknowledge that there are Eurocentric constructions of black women that frame how black women look at themselves, how black men look at black women, how white women and white men, and how everyone is looking at black women. So we talk about three parts of the person as spirit, body, and mind, right? So we have, the first thing is we have sexualized bodies. Historically and contemporarily, black women's bodies are essentialized by their sexuality. Now, it's not saying that we shouldn't celebrate black women's sexuality, but essentializing means we make it the whole of who they are. Meaning when we look at black women physically, we automatically think of them as sexual objects. Now, again, hopefully some of us resist, right, this messaging, but this is how we're taught to look at black women. If you're looking at media, if you're reading books, if you're listening to music, these are the primary narratives of how we're taught and trained to see black women physically, right? When it comes in terms of the mind, the idea that something is criminal or deviant about the way black women think, about the way they speak up, or the words they use when they speak up, or this idea that intelligence is not sexy, right, or intelligence is not valued, right, or that intelligence in black women doesn't exist. Again, these are Eurocentric constructions. We can look at policy changes, we can look at social constructions. Oftentimes when people look at the idea of the welfare mother, or the crack-addicted mother, right? This construction was debunked by Dorothy Roberts when she talked about the issue for what we call crack babies was not the idea of addiction, because alcohol and cigarettes can do more damage to a fetus than crack cocaine can. But it was the reality that because these black women were poor, they didn't have access to health care. And because they couldn't get the proper prenatal care, that's more of a cause of the birth defects for their children than their actual use. There's also studies that show that oftentimes these mothers would end up being incarcerated because they were trying to get things, despite their addiction, that would help support and keep their children healthy. But the construct that was put in the media and that was used to undergird criminal policy portrayed these women as terrible mothers, not caring, criminal, scheming, without putting in context that, crack addiction is not something that is specific to race, right? So there are mothers addicted to crack cocaine in every racial or ethnic group, but the stereotype only applied to black women. So the idea of criminalized minds and then stifled spirits, the idea that black women are considered loud or too boisterous, right, or too present, right? The idea that the way we are jovial or joyful is never celebrated, but always policed. Shh, can you keep it down, right? In spaces where there's nothing wrong with being excited. And I say this because when you constrain how black women exist to these very specific limitations, then you start seeing black women as deviant. You start seeing them as criminal if they portray the things that society has told you not to appreciate about them. Does that make sense? Right? But I say this because I don't want you to feel guilty, because these are the systems that we're born into. This is the society that we all live in. So there has to be a process of recognizing these things so you can try to unlearn and learn a better process. I don't want anyone to feel bad if they've ever held a negative stereotype against black women, you see, there she is, looking black and womanish, right? Sometimes we don't even know what it means, but we know we're looking at something that society has told us is wrong, is ugly, is stupid, is problematic. But again, I don't want you to feel bad, because the way our society is structured, you're supposed to buy into that. That's why it has to be an active unlearning process, because everything we're taught in dominant society is leading us to feel this way. I was gonna play a song, but the link broke. I'll play it afterwards, because I want a reflection. There's a song by Nina Simone called For Women. And what she kind of goes through is the different archetypes of black women that exist in dominant society. I'll pull it up before we leave, because I definitely want you to hear it and reflect on that song. But what I want to talk about is understanding the way that black women's relationships to themselves and to other people in society has been framed by this white supremacist structure that we live in. First, we want to understand the relationship between black women and black men in the United States. Now, we have to acknowledge that systemically we're talking about within the institution of slavery. We're talking about how our ancestors, how our foremothers were seen when they were stolen from Africa and brought to not only the U.S., but the Caribbean and other parts of what we call the Western world. So we have to acknowledge that the purpose for black women being, or African descendant women being here, was for labor, physical labor and sexual exploitation. Right? This oftentimes determines the construction of black women that is seen, because physical labor is about strength, physical strength. The idea that black women were expected to do as much physical labor as black men were. Right? There was no gender distinction between black men and black women when it came to plantation work. But there was an additional set of labor that black women were forced to perform in terms of sexual exploitation. Right? And this was at the hands of slave masters or anyone within white society that was given the permission and had the power to force themselves on black women. One reason is for profit. Does anybody know, well, the slave trade, the actual trade was abolished. So as a practice of saving money, because ships are expensive, voyages are expensive, there became a practice of impregnating slaves. Right, impregnating enslaved Africans, either by breeding two enslaved Africans together to produce offspring, or with slave masters or overseers actually forcing themselves on African women to produce offspring. If anyone's familiar with the one-drop rule, is anyone familiar with the one-drop rule? Summarize it for us. Yeah, cool. Okay.
Well, if you have at least just one drop of black blood in you, then you were technically considered black, in America. So if you were, the child of a slave master and a enslaved woman, then your child would be black. No mixed or half white.
Kind of. Here's the thing. No one actually tested blood, right? So the idea of a one-drop rule was a metaphor. There was not a time when they were actually testing people's blood to determine who had a drop. Also, if you spill people's blood of different colors, there's going to be no way for you to tell this blood came from a black person, this blood came from a white person. That's why we can donate and take blood from each other, because there's nothing fundamentally about people's blood based on their skin color, right? But the one-drop rule specifically said that any child born to a mother who was a slave, regardless of who their father was. In Western culture, they have something called paternal lineage, which generally means that you inherit what your father has, right? But if you had a wealthy slave owner impregnating an enslaved African, technically that offspring has claim to that plantation and that inheritance. So these ideas of one-drop rules shifted lineage to maternal, meaning you get what your mother has when it came to black people, right? So if your mother was a slave, regardless of who your father is, you become a slave. What that allowed plantations to do was grow their wealth. Because if you have 10 children on the plantation, those are 10 people that you can claim wealth from, whether you sell them, whether you work them, etc. Right? So there was also a practice of using black women's reproduction for profit, also for pleasure, right? We have to acknowledge that men who wanted to have sex with these women enjoyed it, right? And this is why we have to talk about these claims that black people are lesser than. We were never too subhuman to use for sexual pleasure, right? So I say that because we don't believe that social constructions are believed by the people who create them. Meaning if you say that a group of people is inferior, oftentimes you don't believe they're inferior, but you know if you can convince the masses to believe they're inferior, they'll be treated as such, right? So there was a level of using black women's bodies for pleasure and just also control, right? Using their bodies to control where they were able to go, where they couldn't, whether their children would be allowed to see them, whether their fathers, brothers, husbands would be killed or lynched. Oftentimes, black women sacrificed their bodies for the sake of their loved ones. So we have to acknowledge that the context of the relationship between black men and black men was always exploitive, never a loving relationship, which again makes it that much more important that people within the communities affirm black women because society has not taught many other people to love them, and it hasn't really taught us to love ourselves. So now we want to talk about the relationships between black women and white women historically. Again, we have a relationship of exploitation but instead of physical and sexual, we're talking primarily political and domestic, meaning that oftentimes gains that white women experience through movements are on the backs of black women, on the backs of black women that rarely get to experience those same freedoms. When we talk about women's suffrage and the right to vote, there are a lot of black women who fought for women to get the right to vote. Does anyone know when black people actually got the right to vote?
With the Voting Rights Act of 65?
65. Does anyone know when women's suffrage was passed? 1920. So you have between 1920 and 1965, where all the black women that put their efforts into women getting the right to vote that weren't able to vote till over 30 years later. Right? But the white women used their efforts, used their strength, their petitioning, their efforts to gain their own rights for suffrage. Another issue is in terms of domestic. There's a book by Angela Davis called Women, Race, and Class, and she talks about the relationship between white women and black women when we talk about domestic servitude. Right? The idea that white women contribute to this oppression because oftentimes they would hire black women to do their domestic work, whether it be cleaning their houses, taking care of their kids, right? So there wasn't a level of women's solidarity and equality because black women were used by white women as not necessarily always property, but as employees, not paid what they were worth, not allowed to spend the time with their children. My family's from Mississippi, and both of my grandparents clean houses and raise children for wealthy white people at the expense of their own children and families. You leave at 4 in the morning, you come back at 11 at night, right, taking care of someone else's kids. And I say that because we still have these constructions of black women as bad mothers, right, because they have to work, because they can't be as doting as maybe they would like to be. But we have to consider the historical context that created this dynamic where white women are allowed to hold this very pious idea of fragile femininity where black women are doing a lot of the work that allows that to be possible while not receiving those benefits. Are we clear on this? And I say this because in order to unlearn a process, you have to understand what you're being taught, what you're being fed, what you're being told to do. Only then can you actually change the way you're behaving. Y'all still with me? Yes. Now, the last thing we have to talk about is the relationship between black women and black men, right? The idea that there's emotional and psychological exploitation. Now, again, we're talking about within the context of a white dominant society that uses divide and conquer as a tool. So this idea of pitting black men and women against each other, again, it's not anyone's fault, but it's the way that we're taught to interact with each other, right? This idea that black women are the backbones of the family and we hold everything together and we give everything we have to our families, to our loved ones. It leads for exploitation because no one is giving that back to us. So when we talk about the ideas for safety, right? For survival and for manhood, like you spoke of. In a capitalist society where men are valued by how much wealth they have and what they can control, in a world where black men don't have a lot of wealth, what do they have that they can control? They're women, right? So a lot of the intimate partner violence we see is an attempt for black men to assert some of the manhood that society doesn't allow them to have. But again, this is using a Eurocentric construction of what manhood and womanhood are. So we have to learn where we got these ideas in order to unlearn them and be better to each other. Again, it's not about blame. It's about really understanding where we get these ideas so we can combat them and be better, right? When we talk about the idea for survival, it's unfortunate that black women were able to get roles, work cleaning houses and taking care of children while black men were excluded from labor forces. But unfortunately, we get pitted against each other, right? And we've developed a culture where men look to women to provide for them, right? Where they get dependent on the woman to, this is Oakland, so the pimp culture is very strong here. The idea that a woman should provide what you need, or it's better or a show of your manhood to be able to get it from a woman than to get it yourself, right? What we don't realize is the damage that does to the women and the messages that it's sending to the youth about how girls and boys, men and women should relate to each other, right? And also when we talk about for safety, I spoke earlier about, and the unfortunate thing is that because this divide and conquer works, instead of acknowledging that the way we act is based on a system that's teaching us to hate each other, we start to point the finger at each other for who did what, forgetting that we're both kind of being played by the same system. So it's not necessarily an indictment, but it's an understanding to say, this is where I got this learning from, and this is what I need to do to change it. You all are with me here. This is a little bit of heavy stuff, but I really hope for this to be transformative. Any questions to this point? Is it about this?
I'm back, Dr. C. All right, I'm going to just say this, right?
Wait, you said a question?
Yeah, one question. Okay. Are black men, why are black men intimidated by strong black women?
I think they're taught to be, right? I think the quick answer is that they're taught to be, right? If you're talking about, flip to the next slide. Let's see if we got it here. Yes. Thank you for the segue. I'm going to get into it, right? When we talk about social constructions of black women and black womanhood that present them as unlovable, we have to acknowledge that it's in contrast to this idea of white women who are supposed to be very docile and very passive. So we have the ideal of what women should be like based on this very small picture of a wealthy, white, Eurocentric woman. Right? She doesn't say much. She speaks when spoken to. She takes care of all the domestic tasks. Right? She's subservient. Right? She doesn't we don't know if she's intelligent because she doesn't say anything. She doesn't work with her hands. And if that's the image that society puts up of what a woman is supposed to be, any woman who is not that is seen as a threat. Right? It's seen as a problem. It's seen as intimidating because she doesn't fit into that specific role. Right? So we talk about the idea that when we look at black women, we essentialize sexuality. We look at and I say this because, unfortunately, I've noticed that oftentimes men and sometimes women are more likely to support women they find particularly attractive. Right? Like, I'll support you if I think there's something in it for me. Right? Which is different from saying I support you because you're a reflection of me and I care about who you are. Right? So we essentialize black women for their bodies, and then we talk about this superhuman strength they have. This idea that, black women can walk through a wall and do all these things that, again, limit, what if I'm too tired to walk through the wall today? Right? What if I don't want to be complimented on my body? Right? Because unfortunately, society is only training us to look at black women physically in very, very specific ways. So what becomes intimidating is any time that a woman doesn't fit in that narrow box, right? Because it throws the structure off. If a woman is supposed to be passive and a man is supposed to be aggressive, if a woman is seen as aggressive, it's viewed as a threat to that man. It's not even viewed that both men and women can be passive and both men and women can be aggressive because we're pit against each other, right? So physically, we have this idea that it's always about sexuality or this superhuman strength. Black women are not respected and acknowledged for the way they show tenderness, right? It's always presumed to be aggressive or dominant or overbearing, right? I see a hand, I'll get to it in a second. I seen some women in the way they deal with their children was very nurturing, but someone said, oh man, they're being really hard on that kid. I thought they were doing a good job in explaining to the kid what they were doing and how it could affect them, but there's always an assumption of black women being hard, right? So we're not seen as being tender. Yes, question from the audience.
I'm not sure if it's a question or not, but I agree with most of the things that you've said so far. And there's so many other things that contribute to the construct of relationship within our race, outside of our race, and different things. And a lot of it is the communication that's been taught. I mean, the communication as far as me being able to express to you exactly how I feel, what my needs are, and you being able to receive that in a way where you don't feel like you have to defend yourself because you're not being given what you felt the other person was. So now, what are you saying? I'm not good enough. And then that brings another situation into the thing. So I think communication is a big, I mean, there's so many factors. I mean, you couldn't even wrap it up in this time that we have here. I mean, people that know. But the communication and the fact of unity being just unity as a whole. You know what I mean? If we're on the same goal, we're trying to get to the same place, let's try to speak in a language where we both can respect each other and understand each other and move toward a common goal. As opposed to, I'm against you, you're against me because you think I'm a punk or something. You know what I mean? And then so now we're butting heads because this image of strength means talking and punching with your fist rather than being reserved in your communication, rather than withholding behavior that's going to put you in a negative light. So to me, there has to be a balance amongst the construct and the society that we live in, as well as the one that we have that's separate, because we are separate in many ways because of the oppression, because if you're on aid, and if your man comes into the house, now we're going to get you off of aid. So there's so many different things that contribute to this.
No, I agree.
But the thing is, the communication of unity is something I don't really hear that often. I mean, you hear about it in the news, hear about it, yeah, something happens, Black Lives Matter, that, and then it falls off. It goes away. Now we're fighting each other again. Or then there's, okay, now we have 9/11. Well, we're not going to worry about the African Americans. We're going to go after the Middle Eastern for a while. And then they got tired of them. Then the attention came back on the black people again. Now, right now, I feel sorry for the Hispanics. You're getting it. You know what I'm saying? And then that's going to blow over. They'll come back to us again. So unity amongst all races is really what needs to be expressed. But we do have to start inside first before we can go outside.
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely agree. But like I say, I want to make sure that, because what happens is we feel bad, right? And I think one of the reasons we feel bad is because we don't know where this comes from, right? You don't know why every time you see a black woman, you think the worst of her automatically. You don't know why anytime you see a young black girl, you think she's fast or she's going to grow up to be trash or something. So I want to make sure we understand where these ideals come from so we won't feel so bad. So hopefully we can move past them because we know that they're not necessarily a fault on our own. Now, once you learn, then it becomes your responsibility to try to do better. But the reality is, I really don't think a lot of us understand what's going on. It's two more. So one is that, again, the intelligence that black women have is framed negatively, right? It's framed as talking too much, being too sassy, being aggressive, right? A black woman in corporate America who express the same type of level of competence that white men do are seen negatively, right? They're seen as being overbearing, right? As trying to be in control of things, where if white men did it, it would be seen as competent. It would be seen as leadership. So this idea that black women are not supposed to be intelligent, they're not supposed to have anything to say. Again, it allows for a space where when you see a black woman speaking her mind, your immediate response is that she's doing something wrong, because society has told us that there's something wrong with that. And then the last thing is that when we talk about this idea of stifled spirit, right? Because black women are seen as givers, we expect black women to always have something to give, right? Forgetting the fact that we need reciprocity, right? We need to be fulfilled the same way we give out. So what happens is when black women start looking out for their own interests in a way of survival or to thrive, they're seen as selfish, right? Anytime a black woman puts herself first. Now, the reality is that if you look at nature and human beings, survival is always the first law of nature. But black women are always expected to sacrifice themselves for someone else, to the point where if we say, you know, if someone asks you to do something, you say, no, I can't do it, I have stuff to do for myself. They'll look at you and say, oh, she too good to help out, right? So there's this construction that we expect black women to be giving, and we don't even acknowledge that we don't often reciprocate what they give. So there's this spirit, body, mind aspect that creates a picture of black women, because they don't fit in these very narrow constructions, as deviant, as threatening, as ugly, right? Because we don't see the fact that society has told us these very specific things that aren't in the interest of black women loving themselves or anybody loving black women. Now, the issue is we as black women often internalize these things for ourselves. So now you try to overcompensate. You try to be extra helpful to deny the fact that someone might call you selfish. You try to be extra giving, right? You try to fit into this box when, unfortunately, the stereotype is going to follow you regardless of what you do. I've been called the angry black woman and never raised my voice. I've been called ghetto and didn't do anything that was out of the norm, right? But what happens is we start self-policing ourselves and not allowing ourselves to be who we are because we don't want to fit into that stereotype, right? Which causes internal anguish. Next one. I'm coming back to you. Anybody know who Lorraine Hansberry is? Poet, playwright, activist, one of my heroines. She wrote A Raisin in the Sun. She has this quote, and it says, "A woman who is willing to be herself and pursue her own potential runs not so much the risk of loneliness as the challenge of exposure to more interesting men and people in general." Right? And I say that because there's always this idea that we're so difficult to love, that we're so hard to get along with, that we're so tough, right? And the reality is pursuing our own interests doesn't make us bad, but what it does is it forces us to try to find the people who will affirm us. What I'm hoping is that the community of people who affirm black women grows, right? And again, it's not about being in a relationship, but if you're a teacher and you have students, right? If you are a mental health worker and you have patients, if you work at the Best Buy and you have customers that come in. My father drives the city bus, and every day he tries to make it a habit to say something nice to the black women that get on his bus, just because, right? Because who knows what kind of day they've been having or what kind of day they're planning to have, because those small affirmations and things go a long way. I want to get you all to ask each other, right? So get to somebody next to you and think about what you do on the daily to show the black woman in your life that you love them. Or think of what you can do daily. And again, it doesn't have to be anything grandiose, but I just want to get some ideas flowing about, now that we know how important it is to love black women, how do you show the women in your life that you love them on the smallest scale? Take a couple minutes and talk about that. Now, I'm going to ask everybody to contribute something, right? Everyone's like, oh, I got to do. So think of something. Think of a way, right? Think of the black woman in your life, whether it's a coworker, whether it's a parent, whether it's a friend. Think of the people in your life and think of ways you can actually show them love on a daily basis. One thing, when I say think of the women in your life, one thing that we have to do when we talk about loving black women is we need to recognize the ways that they feel loved, right? So I may want to buy something for someone, but if buying something for that person is not going to make them feel loved, then the gesture is going to be lost. So be thoughtful and think of, well, one thing I know someone would appreciate, right? Because it's not always just about the gesture. It's about making sure that it's received. So be thoughtful, right? And think of, women in your actual lives. Like, well, next time I talk to my aunt, maybe I should call my aunt, actually, right? Small things. I agree. I think acts of assistance, right? And you were going to say something similar? Yeah, it is. And especially in a world where black women are taught to try to do everything themselves, right? Even sometimes it can seem like we don't want help or need help, but generally we could use some, right? So for the offer to come is always, even if we decline it, it's always nice to know that somebody would be willing to help. So the last thing I want to talk about is what we do to actually change this, right? Because after we become aware of the situations that we're dealing with, I'm never going to leave you without telling you some ways to go forward and make things better. So the first thing we have to do is redefining black beauty and black womanhood, meaning that we have to acknowledge that there are multiple different ways that black women can be, right? Not just in the way we physically look, but the way we act, right? Our demeanors, our likes and dislikes, our behaviors, our attitudes. There's no one right or wrong way to be a black woman, right? So if we expand our understanding and allow us to be who we are, that's going to free up the feelings that we have to constrain ourselves. Because that little girl you talk about who's been told she's too loud, she's going to start stifling her own spirit, right? She's going to stop speaking up. And it's those voices that we need in the world to make sure that there's balance. So one thing we definitely need to do is disconnect the black woman's physical body from sexuality. Black women can be beautiful without being lusted after, right? It doesn't always have to be something specifically about how sexy we are, right? We can be beautiful in the ways that we speak, or the ways that we move, or the care we show for ourselves and other people, right? The way we move doesn't always have to be described in terms of some sexuality. The second thing is also, if it's not sexuality, it's physicality, meaning how strong we are, how forceful we are. Specifically, if you look at black women athletes who are more ridiculed for their physiques than celebrated. If you are any type of athlete and you train to get your body in good shape, you should be rewarded and credited and affirmed for that work, right? So the idea is that when we look at black women physically, we need to stop having a box of how they should look, right? We have an issue if you think black women should be curvy, what happens when you see one that's not? Is she less of a black woman then because she's skinny? Right? We have this very narrow idea of what black women should actually look like physically that we need to get rid of because we come in all shapes, sizes, attitudes, emotions, etc. The second thing is respecting black women's intellect. We have to acknowledge that black women have not been listened to for generations. There's a documentary about a woman, a lawyer, a white woman. Her name is Allred, and she's been speaking up for women for a long time. And one of the commentary was saying she spoke up when no one else would. Black women have always been speaking up and speaking against not only racial injustice, but sexism, right? So the reality that historically our intellect, our insight, our expertise has not been accepted and valued is something that needs to change. If you teach a class and you don't have any black women in your curriculum, then you're stifling the idea of that representation. Right? If every time you mention a great black leader, it's always all men, then you're not respecting the intelligence that black women have always contributed to our movement and our struggle. If you don't know any, right? If you don't know any, if it's not Ida B. Wells or Fannie Lou Hamer, I mean, I can rattle off 100 names. Everybody should be able to. We should be able to acknowledge that any space where we've done great things, there have been black women there. And all black women you see have the potential to do great things, even if they're too loud, right? Even if they're ghetto. The idea that our creativity shouldn't be boxed in is something that we need to be respected for. And the third thing is the idea of freeing black women's spirit. As black women, because we experience so much oppression, we stifle ourselves, right? We don't let ourselves fly because we don't want to be shot down. We don't want to be heard we're too loud, or we're too manly, or we're too proud, or we're too anything, right? So the idea of allowing black women to be themselves and acknowledging you don't have to like everything about a person to love them and appreciate them and respect them, right? Even in the instances where you see a woman who you don't believe is respecting herself the way she should, you still give her that respect. You still speak and try to address the best things you see in her, right? I hear guys say all the time, well, if she let me dog her, I'm a dogger. That's ridiculous. If you have to dog someone out, leave them alone. If you're going to deal with somebody, try to enlighten and speak to the beauty in them, right? If you can't speak to the beauty in them, speak to the beauty in you and hope it will be reflected to how they see themselves. But we really have to do more to allow black women, specifically black girls, to be themselves. We live in a world where there's no place that teaches you how to love black girls or how to love black women. All we're taught is what's wrong with them, right? So we have to start carving out these spaces to just let them be. I see a little black girl running around, I'm excited for her. I don't want anyone to tell her to stop, sit down, be quiet, right? And we have to be the ones, especially for our children, that allow them the freedom to be who they are, right? Because the world is really going to try to change them as much as possible. One way we do that is we have to create spaces in our communities. If it's in a school, if it's in a community center, if it's in your family, we need to create spaces that allow black girls to learn who they are. Learn who they are without the Eurocentric construction of who they're supposed to be in society. Beyonce's great. So is Janelle Monáe, right? So is Serena Williams, right? I'm not the one who believes that we should look to our celebrities for representation. We need people in our communities who we can see, we can touch, that can show us the best in who we are. We need spaces in our community just for black girls to speak to each other and learn each other and learn themselves. And we need spaces for black boys and black girls to learn how to relate to each other. Oftentimes, at a very young age, black girls and boys relate to each other on a romantic level. I remember my 6-year-old cousin telling me he had a girlfriend. I was like, what does that mean? What does it mean to start having romantic type understanding of relationships at such an early age? What it does is it distorts the image of how you relate. So you don't see someone as a comrade or a partner or like a sister or brother. You automatically have a relationship about how this person can meet my needs or how I can get pleasure from this person. And it happens at such young ages that we really need to be intentional about what we do with our children to make sure that they see themselves and they see each other in respectful ways. And the third thing is, if you have black women in your life, listen to them, right? Don't tell them they're overreacting. Don't tell them they're making a big deal out of nothing or they took something the wrong way. Acknowledge the way they're feeling, the emotions they're processing, the hurt they've experienced. You know, a lot of these truths can be very difficult to digest, but we need to get into a space where you can't love a black woman without letting her tell you who she is. You may think your compliments are what she needs, but just to be sure, ask her, right? If you have, and I think the brother back there was talking about communication. We do too much assuming. We assume that someone's going to like what we do, or we assume that someone should be treated a certain way. Instead of just communicating with that person and asking, what can I do for you? How can I help? How will this make you feel better? How will this help lighten your load? You know, sometimes it seems prideful to admit you don't know everything. But when dealing with people, the best thing you can do is say, what do you need from me? Right? Because I think a lot of times the way we deal with black women is from a position that we know what's best for them. But what you need to do is, instead of asking, well, what do you want to do? What are your goals? I know, unfortunately, a lot of young men who are in relationships with young women, and they don't know what the woman's dreams are, what her ambitions are, what her goals are, what her likes, dislikes, desires, and pleasures are. All they know is, well, she supports me. She's there for me, right? She gives me what I need. But you have to be willing to listen and reciprocate because, like I say, and it's not about romantic love. It's just about knowing that we need that affirmation. We need those strong words and that support, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. Do what you can and work to do more. Right. That's all that I have. I appreciate you all for staying. When I was talking about the ways that black women are seen in our society, like their bodies are always sexualized, they're not seen as feminine because they're strong, right? So the gaze is a way that you look at something. So the Eurocentric male gaze means that black women are seen through a lens that pits white women as the ideal type of femininity. And not all white women have very specific, docile, passive, submissive femininity. So as a result, when we look at black women, we measure them to that standard, and then they become inferior, right? If women are supposed to be submissive, and you get a black woman who speaks her mind, automatically we say, well, something's wrong with her because she's not being a woman the way we expect her to. Right? Any other questions? Well, this concludes my presentation. Thank you all for coming.